welcome to the first episode of Hot SciComm Summer, a podcast miniseries where we keep it relaxed, laid back, and talk to folks who are doing great science communication work. This week, we kick off the series with my conversation with Joss Fong. Her official title is a senior editorial producer at Vox, but on her Instagram, she calls herself a video journalist, which I think is a nice way of putting it. She produces these incredible science videos that you can find on YouTube, produced by Vox, and they're about like all sorts of super interesting things. Space, stuff about the coronavirus, stuff about racial bias, stuff about technology. I mean, you can see the playlist of all of her videos. You can find that link in the show notes for this episode. But it's just like one after the other of like, whoa, that's really interesting. Oh, that sounds really interesting. And it's, it's about just all sorts of stuff. But I first came to her work through her most recent video. This came out a couple months ago. And it's called How American Conservatives Turned Against the Vaccine. This video has 1.4 million views or so by this point in time. And I think I first heard about it because in it she interviews Rob Willer, whose he's a sociologist, does a bunch of cool research that I really like. And so I think through him, I found this video. And in watching it, it's this like amazing way of conveying what may be a complicated story, but in a way that just really reels you in and grips you and shows you data that are otherwise abstract to think about, but are put in a really compelling way. So here are some comments from the YouTube video that I think are a testament to the quality of the production value here. One person said, "Aside from the great content, I am floored by the creative direction on this video." Someone else said, "Your presentation was phenomenal." And someone else said, "This is a masterclass in how to use charts effectively." And can you imagine, like a video that is based in large part on graphs and figures is super interesting and creative and compelling and conveys an important idea in a way that it all just kind of comes together and is super captivating. So I was very excited to reach out to Joss and even more excited when she said yes to talking for the podcast, because I wanted to know, a little bit more about how did she get involved in this line of work? How do you make the most out of the online video medium, the kinds of journalistic choices that you make when you're making content like this? I said it. I said content. I hate that. When you're making videos like this, and in particular, how do you create a visual style that is unique and not the kind of thing you see over and over and over again when you look at these kinds of videos online? So this is a fantastic conversation, and I'm so happy that Joss was willing to share a peek behind the curtain. And so, yeah, let's jump into it. I've had a chance to watch some other interviews that you've done and read a little bit of your story as well in terms of like how you got involved in this whole science journalism, science communication, video producing mess. But what I'm kind of curious about is like, okay, you entered this world. What was your work looking like when you first got started, right? Because my sense is there was a little bit of like, okay, I guess this is what we're doing. Like, let's just kind of figure it out as we go along. So what did that work look like in the beginning, and how did you find yourself changing over time in how you approach what you do?
So I went to grad school thinking I would become a science writer. And then sort of soured on writing while I was in school and decided to make the switch to video then. The problem was that I didn't really have any video skills. I'm the kind of person who is very much a dabbler and, can pick up things quickly, but not master things ever, I guess. But I sort of was able to scrap together the basic set of skills you would need to make an internet video through a variety of internships and jobs, and was able to grab the position at Vox when it first popped up. And I think when Vox launched back in 2014, there wasn't really an expectation that video would be a large part of what the brand was offering. That sort of evolved over time as we found a good niche for ourselves in the video world. But at the beginning, I was actually hired as I think my title was multimedia producer. And half of what I did was making charts for the website to go inside of the articles. And eventually, video just became a bigger and bigger part of what our jobs looked like. And as our audience exploded on YouTube, it became clear that that was going to be a really important part of what Vox's brand would be. But, at the beginning, we had no idea really what we were doing, and it was actually such a blessing to be working for people who were as clueless about video as we were, because if we had come into a very mature news organization or had been put underneath maybe someone from television or even from an older digital publication who had set ideas about what video should look like, it would have been very difficult for us to invent what we ended up inventing. But through experimentation and making a lot of bad videos, we landed on what I think is a pretty powerful form of communication, which is this explainer video, which combines narration with archive and animation, some field shooting and interviews.
So if you look at the early examples, right? You say, I won't put you on the spot to like tell me what you messed up, but like, are there kind of themes behind what you'd look at those early videos and go like, these were the kinds of things that we didn't quite get yet?
Yeah, well, we actually launched with a sponsorship with GE for a certain set of videos, and that included a set of long interviews. I mean, long for the internet. They were about 15 to 20 minutes long, where our editor-in-chief, Ezra Klein, would sit down with some wonky expert and just ask them questions. We did a few, I don't know, maybe 10 episodes of that. I think we called it Conversations or something like that. So that package also included a set of short, fully animated videos that we made by essentially interviewing newsroom journalists and then cutting the audio with animations that we would commission. And that worked fine. We didn't have a large audience for those. And it was pretty clear to me that they were not making use of the particular strengths of the medium. I've always kind of had a bias against watching people talk, just because it's just something that TV has always done, just because it's easier, it's faster. But I think I knew early on that we could do a lot more with it. And on the other end of sort of animation, it occurred to me that decorative animation was also not making use of the medium as powerful as it could be. And so what I knew we would have to do is write for video and not have Vox's writers try to carry the videos by just sort of giving what they knew how to do. Video requires a different kind of writing, and fortunately the leadership at Vox allowed us to break away from doing what a lot of news organizations do, which is tie the video producers to writers in the newsroom. And so what that meant was that we started allowing our video producers to write for video and narrate video and pitch ideas and everything. And now at this point, we're almost entirely independent of the journalists in the newsroom. I forgot what your question was, but
Yeah, it was about reflecting on kind of what you learned from those early days, which I think you've done. And it reminds me of something that I wanted to mention, which is I've kind of heard you talk about leaning into the medium, so to speak, right? Like not every story makes sense in the environment of the kinds of videos that you produce, right? Like you can be thoughtful about using this medium and every strength it has, and sort of maximizing that, which is kind of what it sounds like you're saying, like that was what you learned from those early, like, I guess we have these tools and we can slap it on anything. And now it seems like it's a more thoughtful consideration. So like what are the strengths? I guess you think of it, like what are the strengths of this online video medium? Let's keep it there. That you'd say like, oh, there's a certain kind of piece that makes sense in this medium.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing that video has going for it, but also that is a challenge, is that you can't multitask it, or you shouldn't, and you can't skim it. And so that really sets it apart from text articles, which are almost universally skimmed. And podcasts where we're all doing our laundry while we listen to them, you're really asking people to give you the full attention of their eyes and their ears at the same time for the duration of the video. And so that's a big responsibility, because if you waste people's time, they're just not going to stick around. But it's also really powerful because when you have command of someone's hearing and their vision at the same time, you can crack open, I think, levels of comprehension that are difficult to do in text or audio alone. And so that requires a form of video writing that integrates the visual aids with the narration really seamlessly and harmoniously. And so it basically means writing to visuals. And so that's something that we figured out pretty early on and have been training people to do ever since. And it can be limiting in some ways because stories are complicated, and sometimes you want to just, go on a minute-long monologue to get out all the nuances of the piece. But we really try to stick to talking about whatever we can show and cutting the story, cropping the story and the scope of the story at where you stop having things to show people. And that has, I think, proven to be a pretty effective way to keep people engaged for the duration of the piece and to help sort of guide what stories we want people pitching and what we end up greenlighting.
So in terms of like practically pulling that off, right? You say you train people to do this and sort of think about the visuals at the earliest stages of things. Like practically, what does that mean for how you approach actually putting the pieces together? Or maybe even not putting them together, but like as you're discovering what the story is or what the final product is, how do you account for the visuals in that earliest stage?
So we have a pitch template that we give to all of our producers that reminds them that they need to think about what the anchor visuals of the piece will be at the pitch stage. It's literally, a table that if they can't figure out, they know that they do not have a video story there. What we'll also do is ask them for different versions of the same idea or different angles on the same topic. Because sometimes, there's going to be an angle that works great for video in any topic, and it's just a matter of finding it and thinking really proactively about, what you can show people. We've done some training around what types of visuals are quote unquote voxy, sort of relative to other things that you'll see in the world. And I mentioned decorative animation in the past, and one of the big, really great YouTube channels that does it really well is Kurzgesagt, which makes, beautifully animated explainer videos. But we try to make sure that what we're doing is distinct from that, which is that our visuals are not, they're not illustrating what we're saying. They are explaining the topic. So they have explanatory power inside of them. And so that leads you to things like very specific pieces of archive or very specific data visualizations or demonstrations of things or simulations of concepts, flow charts, diagrams, those kinds of things. And so once we have that sort of arsenal of explanatory tools, you can kind of set your research process to look for them. And that's what I think our producers end up doing is a sort of a intuition. While they're doing research, they're looking for what footage of specific moments is there, what kind of data can speak to it, what kind of demonstrations we could film, any sort of field shoots that would speak directly to the concepts, that kind of thing. And then writing is a matter of putting those things in the right order and essentially guiding people through them.
Are there, does any example come to mind of a story? I keep saying story, even though I just heard you lament the use of the word story in this kind of work, but I'm going to lean on it anyway.
No, I still use it too.
So is there a topic, let's say, or a premise that you ended up having to scrap because there wasn't enough that you could do visually for it? Or can you always, is it really just a matter of finding the angle and anything could get it? Or is it really like there are just some things that are too hard to plug into this medium?
No example sticks out in my mind as something that we had to just drop because it wasn't a video story, period. Yeah, I don't think there is one. Well, maybe there is. Honestly, it's hard because our brains will filter them out before they even get to that stage, I
Mm.
think. At least mine does. And so it's hard for me to give you an example.
Hmm. I wonder, just sort of intuiting, if it's less about filtering out so much as it is jumping on it. Like from an audio perspective, there are certain things where I'll come across an idea and I'll be like, oh, this is absolutely something that you could transmit over audio. And it's more like zeroing in on those as opposed to like, oh, there's these 50 interesting things, but 40 of them won't work. It's more like, oh, like I just jump on the stuff that makes sense. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, definitely. And there's definitely some topics where it's just so obvious that that video is great for them. I've done a few videos on linguistics over the years, and
Hmm.
that's an area where because the notation is pretty obscure, I would find it really difficult to explain those concepts in audio, I think, because of the way that linguists describe sounds in text. So
Hmm.
being able to pair audio with visuals is great for that kind of topic. But then, you can see the way that we take an angle on something. So for instance, yesterday we published a piece on the president of Ukraine, and the angle that we took was instead of just, Zelensky explained, we did 8 video clips that explain, or 8 moments in his career that explain this man. And that just helps us sort of narrow it down, especially for this one, which we wanted to do quickly. So any existing imagery is going to be automatically a great video story.
Hmm.
And my very first viral video ever was a critique of the Discovery Channel's Shark Week. This was back in 2014 or 2015, I think. And so that was one where, you know, my skills were pretty rudimentary at that time, and leaning on existing imagery was a really big part of what we were doing.
Hmm.
And so that I just took clips, I critiqued them. To be honest, we weren't as careful probably about copyright as we are now, now that we've got a team of lawyers that looks over our videos before we publish them. But in the early days, it was really key not just to make effective video, but also to like fill in the gaps of my own skills, to lean on existing visuals as a way uh, to explain different topics. And it ended up sort of we ended up internalizing that as a lesson for an low-hanging fruit of a good video
Hmm.
is, explain a photograph, explain a
Hmm.
video clip, or anchor your story around a specific thing that's already documented in film or video.
And even going beyond existing footage, one of the things that I think is very cool about what I've seen you produce is like the creation of original illustrations, but that live not in a digital space, but in a physical space, right? Like I sort of get the sense that that's a little bit of an aesthetic style that you might own, which is like, building a contraption that demonstrates some idea, or rather than just sort of like moving pictures on a screen, it's like what I was just watching, something like here are 3 mugs, and like we're putting pictures in this mug or this mug and moving them around, or in the video that we're going to talk about in a bit, visualizing data using like pieces of paper on a board. Is that like a very do you think of that as like a conscious, I don't want to say trick, but just like a stylistic approach to like creating those visuals from scratch?
Hmm. Yes, I think that for the first several years of our team's existence, we leaned so heavily into computer motion graphics that it became a defining sort of signature of what a Vox video was. It's like, oh, it's just animated explainer. Um, and as the video world grew in the news and sort of informational space, it became very difficult for us to stick out using motion graphics alone. Although I do think, with our font and our style, we still are recognizable in 2D animation. It is just something a lot of people do now. And so I think part of it was wanting to make sure that we continue to stand distinct, wanting to make sure that we don't have one trick, and then the big sort of impetus around there was a YouTube original show that we produced called Glad You Asked, where the concept of the show was very deliberately restricted to tactile, practical props and sets. And that was from a big push from the showrunner of that first season of that show, Lindsay Perna, who I think she just wanted to make sure this show looked different from what Vox was doing. And so she
Hmm.
almost banned motion graphics as a
Hmm.
tool for us. And I think, in the second season, we ended up finding a middle ground where we were still using animation, but just not as much as we would in a normal Vox video. But it was a really good push for us to think about other ways to explain things, making things physical um, and using them with your hands. It is more time intensive and it's more expensive. And so when you have a budget from a show like a YouTube original show, we had the money to spend on people who could build those things for us. It's a little bit harder for our typical YouTube output to do that, but we're still trying to pull some of those lessons in and mix it up a little bit so we're not relying too heavily on motion graphics. As far as the communication of the concepts themselves, I think there's a lot of ways to do it, and they sort of all are equally effective. I don't think that necessarily bringing things into the physical world makes them more understandable or clear. Sometimes I think it actually doesn't make sense and can get in the way, particularly when you're building a chart out of, I don't know, pencils or something. I've never been like fully on board with that. So it's a matter of choosing when you use it. But I think the reason why I've been dabbling in it a lot is because I just see so much computer motion graphics on YouTube right now, and just want us to keep evolving and keep standing out from the crowd.
As I listen to a lot of the examples and ideas that you've conveyed so far, it's sort of very generally, and this is partly because that's the questions I'm asking, very generally just like, what is video? What is it? What are its strengths? And do you think that any of this is like especially in the service of science, right? So you've given examples that are more like political or newsy, as well as the work that you've done in what I might call science journalism or communication. Do you still see yourself as like chiefly someone who's doing science communication, or have you kind of expanded out like how you think of your job?
Yeah, I think I've always thought of myself as video person first and science journalist second. And that's probably because in the early days, it just seemed to me that there was so much um, innovation that needed to happen around video specifically, that I was really interested in figuring out what we could do with this medium. And I'm still really interested in making sure every video that I produce is doing something new, or at least something that's new to me. And that probably is more of a motivating force for me than my training in science journalism
Hmm.
is. My interests are really, really broad, and I find it very difficult to pick a lane and stick with it. So I've produced videos about sports. I've, done things about beauty culture, feminism, that kind of stuff. And um and so I don't think of myself as a primarily a science communicator, but my approach to journalism is always evidence-based. And ideally, I'm always incorporating a lot of evidence in every video and really trying to make sure I understand the scientific landscape before I write anything about it.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was looking at kind of the whole whatever the video version of a filmography is for you, and trying to be like, well, what's the like theme here? Like, is there like a core? And it's because it's all over the place in a great way. And one of the things that then you kind of become suited to speak to is the differences in producing videos about these different kinds of topics. So, for example, part of the reason why I'm coming to this podcast series about science communication is really from a social science perspective, because science communication gets plenty of play, but it's often in the kind of like chemistry, genetics, astronomy kinds of fields. And social science communication, you might say like, the stuff that social scientists do is so almost like more directly relevant to the lives people are living day to day. But we don't get a lot of training or play in terms of like, well, what do we do to take the academic research that's happening in social science and bring it to a general audience? And so having kind of done videos that are about telescopes in space and doing videos that are about racial bias and political attitudes, do you see them as different? Like, do you see the approaches as needing to take a slightly different perspective? Or is it really all the same thing at the end of the day?
I think every story needs a different approach for sure. The sciences that are very physical and literal are much easier to communicate. In my experience, you're literally building a model of a telescope, or, you know, you can show a diagram of a creature's body or something like that. It's really straightforward, very low-hanging fruit when it comes to visual explanation. I don't know that I've developed tricks for explaining the social sciences per se, and maybe my intuitions about what makes a good video have actually pushed me in the direction away from tackling those sciences as
Hmm.
much. But yeah, in the instance of the piece that I did about bias in artificial intelligence, um, I tried to make it as physical as possible. So in that episode, we created a kind of Rube Goldberg machine to try to make machine learning physical. And to be honest, I'm not totally sure how successful it was as a explanation. It was very satisfying for me to create something that felt like it captured my understanding of how these
Hmm.
systems work. It's really difficult for
Hmm.
me to watch that with someone else's brain and know whether these ideas are landing. And that's going to be, I think, the challenge with the science communication always, is that once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. And once you learn it and you understand it, your ability to explain it to someone who does not understand it and has never come across it is just like eroding away the more you know about it. So that's one strength that generalists have, is they're always going into a new topic with fresh eyes and have a very recent memory of
Hmm.
what piece of information made the topic break open for them. So I appreciate that. But the key, I think, for science communication, regardless of the medium, is having an editor who's very thoughtful and does not know what you're talking about and can't tell
Hmm.
you when you are like way too deep, assuming way too much knowledge, skipping over things that you learned and then forgot you learned and need to explain. Um, but yeah, as far as the different sciences go, there's definitely ones that are easier to visualize than others.
So this is actually a perfect transition to talk about this recent video you did on essentially polarization, political polarization surrounding vaccination in the COVID era, which I think it really jumped out to me because it was able to take something that was social science evidence at its heart, but visualize it in a way that people really grasped easily, and did so in a way that, kind of like you're saying, didn't look like any of the other data visualizations that we really see ordinarily. So could you talk a little bit about like where the seed of this came from? Like that first spark of like, oh, you know what? Maybe there's something here to unpack in this format.
Sure. And that credit goes to NPR, totally. I came across a post that their data journalists had done where they were breaking down death rates by county on one axis and the sort of Trump share of the popular vote on the
Hmm.
other. So it's essentially the county version of the charts that I had in my video, which were all state-based. And that was the first time I'd seen pretty clear evidence that conservatives had been dying at higher rates. Obviously, no one collects political affiliation on death certificates. We don't know for sure what the breakdown is of COVID deaths politically, but when you look geographically, especially on a level that's as fine as county data, the trend was clearly there. Um, it made sense, based on everything that we had lived through, that these places would have lower vaccination rates. And knowing that the vaccinations were highly effective against death, you can put it all together. And so that got my mind turning that a grave injustice had taken place against conservative Americans. There's a lot of dancing on the graves happening, people just assuming that this is a matter of personal responsibility. If you avoided the vaccine and then died, well, maybe you deserve to die. I never believed that. Like I never bought onto that because I understand from the history of polarization and media consumption in this country that our contexts are completely different. And the context that set me up for vaccination to be an absolute no-brainer is, not something everyone can take for granted. And so I honestly just wanted to point fingers. Like I wanted to blame people for this. And I wanted to basically make a video recreating the kind of data that NPR had in that piece. And then combine it with interviews with conservatives who had either lost a loved one or, were survivors of COVID, and who could tell me exactly why, exactly who convinced them that they shouldn't be getting vaccinated. And so that I could sort of trace that line from them to Tucker Carlson, from them to whatever radio host it was, sort of try to create some accountability for this. That was the pitch. And then, the research process took, 5 weeks. And my hypothesis that anti-vaccine misinformation was behind this really shifted to thinking that that was an incomplete explanation and that this is more a polarization story, or at least as much a polarization story as it is a misinformation story. So the idea was basically to have one main chart. And then as I did research and came across this really huge wealth of data that the Kaiser Family Foundation had been collecting, I just started collecting charts and I ended up with, 15 to 17 charts, and talked to my editor, and we decided to shift the format to be, a long series of charts instead of just one.
You mentioned the amount of research that you did in terms of timescale. I'm curious about the timescale in general. So, like, could you pinpoint roughly when the idea occurred to you to do this? And because it came out I don't know when this will be released, but it came out roughly March 1st-ish, right? I think the video.
It was published on February 23rd.
Okay.
I went back and looked at this last night. I pitched it on January 5th. So it was a 7-week process, which is longer than normal for a Vox video. And 5 of those weeks were research, interviews, and writing.
In terms of your job, what proportion of your day would you say on average is going toward like this one project?
All of it. All of it. Yeah. So when I'm on a video, it is my whole life. It's not just my work day. It's like my nights, it's my weekends. I really went like into the abyss with this one, just because I really wanted to make sure that I was getting it right. But yeah, my job description, because I've been avoiding management for 8 years, is that I get to focus completely on the stories that I'm working on.
So you, in terms of the process, so you kind of settle on a handful of graphs that you uncover in research, right? You kind of go like, here are graphs that have been already put together by the analysts. And then the process of going from like that to then a script and then something that is filmed, what does that next stage look like?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So there was, there were basically 15 charts. Some of them, I don't know if any of them already existed in the world, but the data was out there. And so I kind of ported it over to a giant Google spreadsheet. So maybe the Kaiser Family Foundation or Pew Research would have published a chart that included this data, and I sort of selected out the parts of it that I wanted, moved them over, and recreated the chart with just those parts. The state data on COVID death rates is something that required a bit of processing, just because I wanted to make sure that I was getting it right. I'm not a data journalist, and so I wanted to be really careful and make sure I wasn't skipping over anything. I knew I couldn't visualize every county in America. It was just too much. It's beyond my skill set. So I decided to take the state level data and then age standardize it to make sure that I wasn't just pointing out a correlation between old people and Republican states. And so that, that took a long time because I don't know how to automate that process. So I just went through one by one and did that and ended up realizing that it actually made the correlation stronger because of the Republicans. The older ones are actually much more likely to be vaccinated than ones that are maybe 40 to 60 years old. So anyway, I just had to do that to make sure. And I wanted to make sure that people who were going to watch this video understood that I had done that due diligence. So that took a while. It was a learning curve for me. And then the other part of this was that we wanted to include voices of people in this piece, which is not something that is my first instinct to do, but I'm trying to stretch myself. And I had a colleague who was helping me reach out and find interviewees who would fit the story, who would be interested in talking about this. And that kind of took a while just to find people and get those interviews scheduled and get on Zoom with them and figure out, what part of the story they would fit into. And then once I had all of that in place, I was able to write these out. And the writing process sort of went by pretty quickly just because it mirrored the logic of my own investigation pretty closely. The logic and chronology was pretty straightforward. And then, worked with a graphic designer to make the charts beautiful, get them printed. And then it was a one-day shoot to get all the footage. The edit probably took me about a week.
So in terms of the visualization part, so the graphs then are made, right? They're constructed, it sounds like, in large part. And then there's the challenge of like, well, how do we, like, I could just PowerPoint this, right? Go like, here's my 15 slideshow. But, like what was the thought? Was it just kind of like let's brainstorm all the different ways that we could possibly display these data to people?
Well, it's a format that I have tried in the past. So back in 2016, I made a video called "The State of Gun Violence in America," something like that. And it's very similar, a stack of printed charts that I then drew on top of. It's a format that I thought worked really well back then, but because my attention span is short, I didn't repeat it. I'm always trying to move on to something else. But now, several years later, I thought, okay, maybe that's an approach that I could update for this story as well. So it was something that I'd tried before, something that I thought people would respond to. I think people really like to see hands working. There's something sort of relatable and engaging about it, something satisfying. It might tap into some of that sort of ASMR satisfying content world. And then the third consideration was, from the start, this is a really sensitive issue. It's about people dying. It's about trust and mistrust of information sources. And I knew that I was not outside of that ecosystem, but part of it as someone who puts out information as online, as someone who works for a news organization that very rarely, if ever, reflects the opinions and priorities of conservative Americans. I just wanted to be as proactive as I could be about meeting people who might not be already on board with everything that I already believe. And I talked it over with my editor, and they thought that if we were to do really polished motion graphics, it wouldn't be as approachable as if it was literal human hands, literal printed paper, and a little bit of my face saying like, I'm trying to figure this out. And you can watch me try to figure this out. And, I don't know. I don't know if this reached anybody beyond who we normally reach, but I think we did our best shot, and that making it really physical set us up to do that as best as we could.
In terms of the physicality of it, one thing also I was going to mention earlier, another thing you do in this video that's very cool is in your interviews with these people, it's not, you could just sort of take like, here's the footage of them, and we'll cut it together sometimes with the footage of you. But instead of taking the actual call, like you are filming the call, right? Like, and there's a moment where you zoom in on the like little icon of yourself in the top half of the screen, right? And so that is a very like that's a choice that you made as well. Does that follow the same kind of logic that it's like, hey, I want you to know we're not like slick, just sort of like doing all the fancy stuff, that I just kind of want to see you. I want to show you myself learning this. That's kind of like just to reflect what you just said back to that.
Yes.
I'm sort of putting, I'm analyzing your choice for you, but like, what was that choice? Like, what was behind that?
Yes. And I think this gets back to some of the influences of participating. Glad you asked. And the ethos of that show being that you would kind of tag along with a journalist learning about something. That ended up, because of the way that television production works, being a little bit more artificial than transparent. But the intention was that you really are watching the reporting process. And so I keep wanting to make a real effort at that, to like really show what it looks like to try to go out and find information, because people don't know who to trust. They really don't know if they come across any piece of media, if it's something that they can believe or not. And if I can just show you that I'm doing my job, I think that it goes a little bit further to building that trust. The other part is that what you can do when you show yourself asking people questions and talking to them is you can shift some of the voice of God voiceover into a more conversational space. So there are pieces of information that I can deliver through my interviews to that person, get their response, that allow me to take it out of the narration. And so that's a tool that I've been playing with lately, is thinking really far in advance of what pieces of my questions I might want to put in the actual piece that deliver information, but also feel conversational. And I think it's something that I'll continue to work on. But it also helps to take some of the pressure off of feeling like you need to have a visual for every moment of the piece. People like, I think, some engagement, some interaction. It's very like pretty far from what traditional journalists would think is proper journalism, in terms of like the story is not about you, it's about the story. But I think on YouTube, there's a big tolerance for seeing creators in action. Creator, I don't really use that term for myself, but that's the culture of YouTube, and I think there are some things that journalists can borrow from it.
And it goes beyond just you too. So like, who else would have had like a fairly heavy hand in the creative execution of this video?
Yeah, so my collaborator, Aaron Filke, who did the graphic design for the piece and also the camera work, he came up with the idea of using transparent film. So I was just thinking, okay, we'll print all these charts and I'll draw on them. It was pretty clear that, as much as I love bar charts, they get repetitive after a while. And so he introduced this idea of adding transparent film as a way to add layers to the visual. And that ended up adding so much to the piece, because once you have data that you can actually move around, then you can use it in interesting ways. So that was huge.
I love, and you could draw comparisons so easily. That the moment where you like fold one over on itself to like show the relative difference, it was just like, whoa, that's perfect.
Yeah, I've never done that before, and I was pretty excited when we figured out that was going to work. And it's just a matter of like choosing the right colors and printing half of the chart. That was like genuinely a tiny innovation that I was really excited about, but something I hadn't tried before. So really credit him for those ideas. And then, we had story editors on the piece. A big change came like after the fine cut was finished. My editor said, "What do you think about chopping off the first minute?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, yes, you're right." The first minute of the piece had been this big wind up. I couldn't see that it needed to go, but she could really see that. So that was really useful as well.
Were you in the earliest days, would most of this have been your own work? Like you would have been one person doing the editing, the writing, the visualizing? Or was it always kind of this setup?
Yeah. Vox has come a long way in the way that we approach video making. The early days, because we were such a small, scrappy team and didn't have the audience to demand a big budget, was very much sort of one-man band type of operations, which ended up being really useful just for my own education. And the video that I did on gun violence in the same format, you can look at that and see what it looks like when one person is behind it versus the current video, which was a bigger collaboration, not just on the visuals, but also I had someone helping me source those interviews. The fact that there were interviews at all, I think, is the influence of other people helping me think through how we could make this format more impactful. So yes, in the early days, we were doing it differently. Now we have more division of labor, but I think it's still probably less than what you would typically see in a TV operation or even our competitors at, Vice or BuzzFeed.
Does one, like, in terms of like do you yearn for the days where it was just, I mean, maybe not like that's the only way to do this, but just like, are there moments where you go, oh, what if I could just like handle all the pieces of this? Like, would that be more satisfying versus what are the benefits of doing this in a collaboration?
They still let me handle a lot, pretty much as I want. So the fact that I'm still editing the videos gives me that sense of real ownership over the tone, the pacing, the look. The collaborations are just making everything better because they fill in the skills that I don't have, particularly around production value and things like that. But typically, I'm still editing the videos myself, and I prefer it that way as opposed to with Glad You Asked, where it was even more division of labor. I wasn't editing the videos. That was more of a frustrating situation, but I've got a pretty good balance on the typical YouTube video operation where they give me the space and time to really think through the story, to produce it myself, even though I might be slower in some ways than other people if I was teaming up more, but then also give me the support that if we want to hire someone who's going to run the camera or something like that, then we can do that. So it's really arrived at a really great place.
So when you mentioned that you had an editor on the video, this is more like in a journalistic sense, like a story editor, not a film editor?
Yes. Yeah. To clarify, because it's confusing in video, every Vox video has a script editor, and they're looking at the text script of the story before you go into production. Then after production, there's a video editor, and typically on a Vox video, that person is the person who wrote the script. Not always, but often. And in my case, I like to hang on to that part.
So to go back to, you had mentioned the other elements in this video in terms of the interviews that you would have to do. And you framed those as aspects of the production process that you are less likely to do when you're putting these kinds of things together. So this video included like conversations with people, everyday Americans whose lives of themselves and their family were affected by vaccine rhetoric. Also interviews with experts in the field. And so, part of me thought that this was sort of like, oh, you need these three things. You need the visuals, you need a interview to sort of cement the reality of the situation, and an interview with an expert. And like, that's the secret formula. But it sounds like that's sort of like not the standard protocol that you normally approach this with. In what way do you think about like the essentialness of those three pieces versus that they just were called for this story?
Yeah, it's really hard to know because I think there are a lot of different effective versions of the same story, and you can add and remove pieces, and it's difficult to say what the most effective versus least effective approach is. Every time you add elements to it, you're increasing the runtime of the piece, which is going to decrease the number of people that get to the end of it. So it's really hard for me to say. In this case, I think that it's such a serious topic and is so prone to, I think, insensitive reactions on the part of people who have a difficult time understanding why you would resist vaccination, that it really benefits from seeing a human being on the other side of that, particularly a human being who's become very sympathetic by changing their mind. And so I just knew from the start that I wanted to get in touch with those people, not just to say like, hey, look, there's a human being here, but also to actually ask them, why didn't you get vaccinated, or why didn't your brother get vaccinated, and what were they watching, what were they listening to, What were they thinking about? Just for my own reporting process to understand it, because so few people in my own social circle had any hesitancy whatsoever with the vaccination. So that was key. The reason I don't do it, the reason I don't naturally jump to it is because when you're creating a story about someone who died, and that story is not about that person and their life, you're using them for a different story, and there's just something inherently difficult ethically about that. It's how journalism works, but it feels not always good to extract a story for the purpose of a larger thesis. In this case, everyone that I talked to had already spoken publicly that their loved one wanted to get out a message in the world. So that's why I felt comfortable bringing them into it. But it's still something that feels it's a little tough for me. And so I'm often happy to avoid it.
Can these stories exist without that like human element, right? Like does it feel like something's missing when they're not there, or is it really just like, no, there are plenty of versions of this story that could have been, here are the data, this is the story, goodbye and thank you?
Yeah, I think that there are many versions, because at least from my perspective, whenever I see an anecdote in a piece, I know I can see the wheels turning on the part of the journalist about how they are picking and choosing what they put into that piece for the service of the story they're telling. And so I don't know that any of it is as impactful as we think. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I clearly have like unresolved ideas about how to bring anecdotes into explainer journalism, when the whole point is that we're talking about context and not individuals here. Um, the thing that I have come to realize over the years is that people are almost always going to remember individuals and individual stories more than they remember the million facts that we give them that flesh out the context. And so I hope that by bringing in those stories, some of the memorability of them can kind of attach itself to the information that I was hoping to deliver. But it's equally as possible that instead of remembering the facts, they are remembering the emotion of that story. Um, I would love if someone did some research on how people process journalism like this, because I have no idea what sticks, what people what makes people keep paying attention, and then maybe a week or two down the line what they actually remember from what they watched, because it's really hard for me to say.
Yeah, in the persuasion world, there is some work on like narrative persuasion and sort of this notion that like, oh, through a story, you will kind of come to, adopt some perspective that you hadn't had before. So there is some sense that like the emotionality of a message resonates, or the being able to identify with the character resonates. But I think I'm dwelling on this idea a little bit just because the advice is often like, okay, you have your science, that's fine. But like first you got to present like an anecdote that gets people on board and then present the science. And it's never clear to me like how essential truly is that? And also kind of to your point, like, what is it if people come away and all they remember is the story? This happens when I teach and I ask on a test, like, hey, describe this. And they kind of regurgitate the story that they heard. And I'm like, well, that's not really the study that we talked about. Like, that's what I wanted you to remember. But you remember like this one very specific case, which is, it's not bulletproof, right? Like it's an example, but you can't deploy that as evidence for the point that we're making because you can attack it from too many perspectives. So I don't know. I was curious in that it seemed like something that you were in the midst of figuring out what its relevance was. So I just wanted to push you on it.
Yeah, and it gets back to what you mentioned before, which is that I've always been uncomfortable with the term storyteller, which is a way that some journalists describe themselves. And it gets to what are the different strengths of explanatory journalism versus narrative journalism versus news journalism. And, how you evaluate good narrative journalism is whether the story grips you. And how you evaluate, good news is whether they are providing more information that didn't exist in the world. For explanatory journalism, it's much more difficult to evaluate because it essentially requires a great deal of expertise to know whether any given piece, any given explainer is doing a good job providing the context for the story. And so I'm still like very dedicated to making sure that that's the mission, and that's the mission of the news organization that I work for. But it's very difficult to avoid the fact that in my own consumption, I see myself responding to stories and responding to narratives, not necessarily seeking out explanations. It's like this very human thing that's very difficult to avoid, and I still haven't quite resolved how it intersects with what I do and what I should be doing. But I don't think it's essential, and I think you're right that it's potentially distracting from the main point. So I could easily see someone remembering from my video that there was this radio host in Tennessee, and he was skeptical of the vaccine, and then he died, and not remember the fact that polarization on the vaccine started in May 2020 or before. And that's the point of the piece, is that our political leaders were very short-sighted in the early stages of the pandemic. And clearly they could not have predicted that we would end up here 2 years later with 1 million dead Americans. But it's something we could learn for next time if we pay attention to the role that political cues and partisan cues play in cementing people in these camps in a way that becomes very difficult to erase later on. I don't know. That was the point of the piece, but I could see how, putting in emotional stories might actually make that harder to take away.
Mm-hmm. But by way of wrapping up, the last thing that I wanted to get your take on is just, you've been doing this for a while. You've produced a bunch of these things, and as you look back, like imagine someone comes up to you and they say, I want to make science videos. Like, I'm interested. Maybe this is someone who's in a science PhD program. They're interested in sort of branching out and conveying this work more broadly. Based on what you've learned over the years of doing this, what kind of tangible or abstract advice might you give this person?
I think one of the really important things, and maybe one of the things I didn't realize as much at the start, was how important it is to really develop a taste for effective video. And that means watching a ton of it. If you want to make videos for the internet, watch a ton of internet videos. Set aside an hour of every day to watch YouTube or TikTok or Vimeo, and decide what you think is working well. Pay attention for when your mind is wandering and when it's not, when you feel like you want to click away and when you don't. And then, reverse engineer what you see that's effective and think, okay, what did they need to get to create this? Like, what exactly did they have to do to make this? I think that would be a really good practice as long as it's done, consistently and regularly. That will help you sort of skip the process of making a ton of really, really bad videos. You still have to do that, but I think it can shorten the process if you become a very dedicated student of good video. And then I think one thing that people still do wrong is wait for a platform or wait for an employer to give them the opportunity. And there's no reason why you can't have an audience, or even not an audience, but a platform, without any, news organization or any corporation giving you a job. So make stuff, just put stuff out there. We often will get applications of people saying, I can do this and I can do this and I can do this. And then it's like, okay, well, prove it. And they don't have the clips to show, I animated this, I wrote this script, I researched this. Often they'll have, maybe they were part of a TV station at a college, and the piece that they give us was created by 5 different people. And it's very difficult to tell what they did versus what someone else did. So even if it's as simple as a TikTok, we just want to see your creativity level, your interests, your sense for story. And you can do that without any budget at all.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat about this stuff. It was super great. And kudos again on the polarization video.
No problem. Thanks for being interested.
big thank you to Joss Fong for giving us a look at her approach to producing science videos. I took away a bunch of useful insights from this, and I hope you did too. You can look at the notes for this episode in your podcast app or online at opinionsciencepodcast.com. And in it, you'll find a link to Joss's work and also specifically some of the videos that we talked about. Okay, one down, many more to go. This has been part of a special summer science communication miniseries. So stay tuned each week this summer for more conversations like this one. And spread the word, too. Like, I was thinking we should make a hashtag, like hashtag Hot SciComm Summer. I don't know how many years it is into the internet, but for some reason I still don't 100% understand hashtags. Nevertheless, I don't know. I think we should do it. Hashtag Hot SciComm Summer. Let's get some buzz around this thing. This series is presented by my podcast, Opinion Science. If you're coming here for the SciComm content specifically, go poke around the past episodes too. The show is about the science of our opinions, where they come from and how they change from a whole bunch of different perspectives, different social sciences, different forms of actual communication in the world. And I don't know, I think if you're here for science communication, you'll enjoy that kind of stuff too. Okay, next week, we keep the momentum going with another fantastic chat.
You want to be careful not to get sucked into the thing that, the scientists are fighting about, and keep reminding yourself, like, what do people just want to know? My name is Meryl Horn. I'm a producer of Science Versus at Gimlet and Spotify.